Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're going to be starting today's webinar in just a moment. We're going to give everyone another minute or so to log in and get settled. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brittany Nelson, and I'm Vice President of Sales Operations and Corporate Training here at Innovate MR. We are an independently owned global sample firm which specializes in consumer and B2B sample with a strong focus on advancing the industry and shedding light on a variety of important topics such as data quality and participant experience. I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, MR Blockchain Solutions. Has anyone asked what participants think? Andrew and Lisa have presented together many times over the years, most recently at IIEX in Austin and the next show in Chicago. This webinar is a continuation of their presentation, where we will take a deep dive into this issue and see how participants perceive blockchain, the challenges faced by participants, and the potential impact of blockchain on our industry. First things first, some quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar is scheduled to run about 45 minutes, with some time at the end for questions. Please feel free to type those into the interface at any time. All participants have been muted, and a recording of this webinar will be sent to all attendees in the next few days. To get us started, I'd like to first introduce our participants. Andrew Cannon is Executive Director for Global Research Business Network. Andrew is passionate about the role that research businesses have to play in enabling decision makers to both make better decisions and to be more customer citizen-centric. Andrew is also passionate about the role that national associations have to play in promoting and protecting the research industry. Welcome, Andrew. Lisa Wilding Brown is Chief Research Officer for Innovate MR. As a 16-year veteran, Lisa is responsible for research on research, best quality practices, and sampling methodologies. She has presented at the MRMW, the Insights Association, IIEX, SampleCon, and Next, and has contributed to trade publications such as Greenbook, Wire, and the GRBN. Lisa has published research on engagement, survey design quality, and mobile best practices. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Brittany.
So that brings us to the heart of today's discussion, exploring blockchain solutions in market research. There's been much buzz of late about blockchain and how it may be able to solve ongoing quality issues in the market research ecosystem. Proposed solutions pledge greater transparency and cost advantage throughout the sample process and are pitched as a way to ensure the safety of research participants' personal data. Considering the low level of trust people report to have in market research companies currently, could a blockchain-based solution boost trust, industry image, and participant engagement? Well, luckily for us, we have two industry experts here to help us answer those questions. I, for one, am excited to hear more. So without further ado, take it away, Andrew and Lisa.
Thanks, Brittany. Appreciate the nice introduction. And Andrew, I'm so pleased to be pairing with you once again. This is exciting. We've done several different presentations through the years, and this one in particular has gotten, received quite a bit of great feedback. So it's good to have you on today's webinar, Andrew.
Happy to be here, Lisa.
All right, let's just jump right in. Andrew, do you want to cover the first slide?
Yeah, definitely. I can look at this. So this chart shows the level of trust the general public have in different types of organization, in different types of industries. And as you can see circled in red, about a quarter of people say that they trust market research companies. And obviously, that really is a hard dose of reality that we have to be aware of. The public's trust in our industry is not particularly high. So you can see, yes, it's slightly better than government, social media companies, but it's lower than things like internet search engines, Google, Bing, for example, and definitely lower than things like online stores. So I think as sort of a background to the blockchain issue, we have to understand and appreciate that our industry is entering this discussion from a low level of trust, right? It's not that we have a high level of trust and we can just put new things out to people and expect them to trust us with their data. So if we consider, the drivers of trust, when we looked into that, we found that participant engagement is a huge driver of trust, right? So the experience people get when they participate in a research project hugely influences how they're going to trust us moving forward. But one of the other things which clearly drives people's trust is the perception of how well they perceive we are, collecting and appropriately using and securely storing their data. So, as you know, Lisa, in the world, there's been a lot of breaches over recent years of data. So people are becoming very aware of the issue, and they do question, the level of security, the level of appropriate use of their data. We as market research companies ask people for a lot of data, for a lot of personal data, and therefore it's only natural, that they question, can they trust us with their data? So I think, that's a good background for us to sort of dive into the issue to understand, look, we're going from a low base, a low starting point. Anything we propose which is new has an uphill battle, has to climb to increase the level of trust, and just can't take for granted that the people are going to accept what we say as the truth.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Andrew. I think you make a bunch of great points there. I think there's a sort of this interesting cross-section within our space right now. We know participant perceptions are pretty low when it comes to trust. We also know that research buyers are running into more and more quality issues because cyber fraud is at an all-time high. Forbes recently released a study that indicated that the cost of global cyber fraud is expected to reach $6 trillion by 2021. So it's not only affecting our industry, but it's also affecting many, many other industries and government agencies. And then, at the same time, there's just greater consumer awareness around their rights around privacy and data collection. And so I think that that's something that is really important to take note, and really was the impetus for us doing this research. We wanted to understand what participants think about blockchain because there's been a lot of discussion, I'd say, in the last 12 or so months at several different conferences, Andrew, that you and I have attended. Many new firms, startups are coming up with blockchain-based solutions, which is really exciting. I'm very intrigued by the tech itself, but I really wanted to understand, just given my background with panels and community development, really what do participants think? And so that kind of feeds into this next slide here. We actually conducted a quality webinar where we talked about some of the tactics that fraudsters are utilizing. And we ran this webinar last month here at Innovate MR. And we wanted to do some quick polling of the audience. Now, of course, the end size was fairly small. It was only about 150 attendees. And we have quite a few attendees on today's webinar, which is great to see. But we wanted to sort of take a litmus test and understand how important sample quality is to market research buyers. And the great news is that it was very high. 97% consider sample quality very important. And then the next kind of area we wanted to explore was, there's a cost to managing quality. There's lots and lots of layers, both things that you might build internally, as well as resources that you would leverage externally through third-party APIs, mobile verification, reCAPTCHA, PII verification through things like FedEx or the US Postal Service. All of that requires tech development, time, and resources. And so we wanted to understand, okay, we know quality is really important for the research community, but are they willing to pay more for that? And the good news is that, overall, most of the participants in that webinar indicated that at a minimum, they would pay a bit more at 52%. 41% indicated they would be willing to pay a premium, with only 7% of our audience indicating that they were unwilling to pay more for good quality samples. So I wanted to sort of share that. I think that's really, very interesting as a backdrop, this sort of positioning of consumer knowledge, demand for privacy, upcoming legislation in California. The CCPA goes live in January. Last year's massive legislation out of the EU with the GDPR, and then of course the quality issues that our industry has been facing for some time. And really, could blockchain be a solution for all of those challenges? And so, to start us off, just so we're all working from the same baseline, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is blockchain? And for those that are newer to the term, it's a system in which a record of transactions is maintained across several computers that are linked in a peer-to-peer network. And I was reading an article recently that sort of likened blockchain to the notary of the internet, which I thought was a really great analogy to make. But essentially, it's a digital ledger that would allow us to validate the information that we receive from respondents, so that we're not sort of looking at things in a singular perspective or one moment in time, but that we have several replicable copies of that information to really increase the confidence level. And there's a lot of other benefits to blockchain. The more we know about respondents, the more we can match them to surveys and help increase the qualification rate, which we also know is a big challenge in the space. So, we'll jump into some of the benefits there and really sort of talk about what our findings were here next. So the research, why did we do this research? We really wanted to understand if blockchain could be leveraged for market research and what participants think about this. And there were a few different study objectives. Number one, we wanted to understand the perception of blockchain and its application in our space. We also wanted to understand if blockchain and the utilization of blockchain would increase or decrease trust in MR companies, because we know, based on the data from the GRBN study that Andrew covered on that first slide, we have a lot of room for improvement. And then the last question that we really wanted to understand, is could it really help to improve participation rates if respondents feel that there is a more secure environment, a more relevant environment for them? Would it allow them to participate more frequently? Would it attract new participants that maybe haven't been exposed to MR in the past? And would we be able to really widen our sample universe, which is an incredibly important thing that we need to do as an industry? So let's talk a little bit about our methodology. We fielded 1,000 completed interviews. 500 of those interviews came from the Innovate MR panel. We also gathered 500 interviews from an outside marketplace. And then we also conducted a supplement of 300 completed interviews, working in collaboration with the company Opinions Ltd. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Opinions, they are an offline methodology research company that owns several facilities nationally, dozens and dozens of facilities, and they do mall intercept research, in-facility offline research, where they're interviewed, respondents are interviewed by moderators and interviewers on site. So we really wanted to understand, would an offline sample think the same way and share the same feedback around blockchain as an online panel would, and were there differences there? So we wanted to explore that. The outbound sample that was dispatched for the study was balanced by age, gender, region, ethnicity, and income. Of course, it was a mobile optimized survey because that's very, very important to do in 2019. The length of interview was just around 10 minutes, short and sweet, and we fielded the studies in late March of this year for about 10 days. So let's jump into our findings. Okay, first one here is, we wanted to understand our participants having discussions around privacy and data security. The good news is that 53% of those that participated in our survey are definitely, having those discussions, indicating that it is something that's important. It's part of the dialogue that they're having with their family and friends, and therefore something that's important. And we see this in a lot of the news that we read and hear about with all the data privacy breaches from major multi-billion-dollar brands, government agencies, you name it. We know that privacy is really top of mind for consumers. And so kind of the first answer to the question, what does blockchain awareness look like among consumers? And unfortunately, from our findings, we have a lot more work to do on this new technology that's available for the MR space. Only 20% of those who we surveyed indicated an awareness level, top 2 box awareness or familiarity with the terminology blockchain. And we wanted to ask that among many other terms. So, we asked them about antivirus software. You can see there the awareness is very high at 92%. We asked them around other security-related, fraud-related terminology, things like phishing, bots, of course, cryptocurrency. I think cryptocurrency and blockchain, those two terms really go hand in hand. Awareness was much higher for cryptocurrency than blockchain itself. And then we even included some fake things in here, some trap questions to really make sure that people were being honest and forthright with us. So there's no such thing as cyber futons or mixed coin pathology, but we wanted to understand if people had awareness around that to term them out of the survey and make sure we're just dealing with honest participants. And so the big sort of elephant in the room is here, 80% are unfamiliar with blockchain. And we saw as well in our offline study that 83% of those participants indicated that they were not familiar with the term as well. So again, lots of room for improvement, nothing that is a deal breaker for the technology itself. It's just indicative of the need to educate participants and be transparent, which you'll see is a big takeaway from our findings. So the next thing we wanted to do is really understand what the general sentiment was around blockchain. And I'm also including here in the presentation some additional terms that we will be sharing with you. So 1/3 had a positive feeling. So these are people who indicated that they were aware and familiar with blockchain. We wanted to understand, well, how do you feel about it? Is it, something that is negative, neutral, or positive? And so 1/3 felt positive sentiments towards blockchain. We found similar findings to those in the offline population. Again, more room for improvement here in terms of sentiment and familiarity. Next, we wanted to ask about cryptocurrency. We wanted to sort of get some baseline data and some comparison data to understand how people's perceptions of blockchain compare to things like cryptocurrency and antivirus software. So the next one is on cryptocurrency. 23% indicated a positive sentiment on that term. Next up is antivirus software. So here you can see 80%, just over 80% feel positive towards antivirus software. And I think the relationship here, Andrew, is because we've talked about this, is that you can sort of make the correlation that, the more familiar you are with something, the more comfortable you are, and the more likely or the high propensity to feel positive towards that term. And so we think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, although when you look at cryptocurrencies, that's not the case, right? There's a higher level of familiarity, but a lower level of positivity for that. So, it's obviously can go both ways.
Yeah, and I think too, what might be playing into that is just sort of time in market. Cryptocurrency, while it's been around for a very long time, I think it has been sort of nested and siloed to a certain type of consumer. And so a wider population may not even have exposure to what cryptocurrency really is. So that could certainly be at play as well.
Well, and I think, Lisa, one of the conclusions is obviously, if somebody wants to propose a blockchain solution to the general public in the MR space, they shouldn't necessarily be using cryptocurrency as an example of its uses, right? It's not going to add a positive halo to the term if they associate the blockchain with the cryptocurrency.
Agreed. I think that's a really great perspective. The other thing here to make note of as well is we wanted to understand people's understanding of blockchain, right? So not just about testing familiarity, but also understanding, can they even pick out the correct definition? So what we did here at this question was we presented the correct definition of what blockchain is, and then we also included other definitions of other terms to see if those who were familiar could actually pick out the correct definition, and only 62% were able to select that correct definition. So again, more opportunity for people in our space looking to leverage a blockchain solution to really go ahead and make sure that they're being communicative and transparent with participants, and that there's a comfort level that needs to be achieved here that we haven't quite realized. What was interesting too is we did see a pretty sharp difference with those folks from the offline study. Only 36% were able to select the correct definition there. So I'll send it back over to you, Andrew. We have some interesting open-end data to share as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very interesting. You know, I spent quite a long time reading through all the different open-end feedback we got when asking people, you know, what they think about the concept of blockchain as a security solution for online consumers. And I just wanted to, you know, pick out 4 here, which basically show what I would say are the 2 sides of the coin, right? One is a more positive take and one a bit more negative in terms of a fear around the technology. And you know, I think, you know, at the one hand, there's the belief that, you know, this is the best thing out there in terms of data security. But on the other hand, there's also the belief, well, you know, the hackers, the dark web as such are only going to get better, and at one point in time they will crack this. So, you know, there's a skepticism there as to whether this technology can be infallible, unbreakable forever, which, you know, lies in, I suppose, the crux of the issue. You know, if the data is there permanently, and at some point, you know, whether it's 10 years from now, somebody does break into it, that's a lot of data on somebody that's going to be stolen, and whether that can then be, you know, identified to that person, even though there might not be any direct PII within the blockchain. You know, as you know yourself, if you have enough information on somebody on different characteristics, you can quite easily piece together who that person is. So, you know, you can imagine people's concern around that issue. So yeah, you know, reliable, trustworthy. And I think the last one's good, right? So if it's handled by the right company. So, and that brings us back to the original trust question. You know, if people don't trust market research companies in general with their data, why should they trust them with a solution that makes, you know, the data permanent as such? So, you know, we not only have to build the awareness of the tool and how it's of value to people, but also we have to work very hard to build that level of trust in general with market research companies, and in particular with respect to how we you know, collect, appropriately use and protect their data. There's a lot of work we need to do to improve our image on those issues.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. Another area that we looked at, Andrew, was likelihood to participate. So if we were to develop a blockchain-enabled MR panel, would participants move over and agree to participate? Over 50% said that they would be likely to join an MR panel. 44% were in the top 2 box for the offline. What was interesting, though, is when we asked folks if they would be willing to participate, 26% indicated that they would not, both from online and offline. We saw the exact same percentage amount there. So I think that sort of begs the question of, okay, if 26% indicate that they would be unwilling to join, how does that impact our sample universe? You know, I think it's no secret in 2019, we run a lot of really difficult research studies. The online space has really matured since we first started doing online research all those years ago. You know, back in the day when we first started, we were running really high incidence studies, and it was pretty easy to get the target populations that we were looking for. But now a lot of researchers are out there buying, you know, sub 10% IR, even 1-2% IR populations. And so we need every bit of sample that we can get. And so if we did see a potential for 26% of panelists indicate that they weren't interested, you know, could that actually see the inverse? Would we actually see a reduction in overall response and feasibility? And so from my mind, before we kind of make quick moves on that, I'd want to continue to do more research, do more education to make sure that there wasn't a negative impact on feasibility, because it is such a struggle.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, Lisa. I mean, I think, obviously this is based on the 20% who are familiar with blockchain. So the first question, or the first thing we need to consider is, as we start to educate the remaining 80% about this, irrespective of whether we use the name blockchain or not, but, under the assumption, we're going to be transparent, and we're going to explain to consumers and panelists and potential panelists what's going to happen with their data, what they're going to get involved in. How does that number, that 52%, how does that develop as we move from this 20 through this other 80%, as we educate people? And can we do it in such a way that that 52% increases, right, to a higher level, and that 26% drops to a lower level? Because, as you say, we cannot afford to lose people in our ecosystem. On the other hand, I think that the positive flip side of this is, 44% of those who are currently not interacting with market research companies who are not in the panel, could be interested. So, there is perhaps an opportunity, if we position this correctly, to get some fresh blood, as it were, some new different types of people into the ecosystem. So I definitely see that as a potential upside, alongside this potential downside. So if we can play it right, reduce the downside, and then sell the concept in a way to those not currently interacting with online surveys to actually become interested and participate, hopefully we could see some upside.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. I think with more communication, like you said, greater levels of transparency, it's quite possible that we could widen the sample universe out there and get more and more participants who maybe aren't familiar with market research and survey participation. We could get them into the mix as well, which is always a good thing, right? It's all about being able to project back to the general population. And if our sample universe continues to shrink, that becomes more and more of a challenge. So, it's always the same way, Andrew. The research that you do, sometimes you go out trying to answer the questions that you have, but then it often sort of brings up new questions, right? You don't always get all the answers. It sort of surfaces new questions to ask. So I'm sure we'll probably do a part 2 of this study and dive in even deeper.
Yeah, that's why we love doing this, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Next area that we looked at were, our blockchain panels preferred over traditional panels. And again, this is another area where it is quite nebulous in my mind. You can look at it from both angles, right? I mean, 50% indicated they were undecided. 20% indicated that they would stay with traditional. Again, sort of the skeptic in me, or sort of the realist in me, I guess I'll say there, is, oh, what is that going to do to my feasibility? What is that going to, how does that impact sort of the commercial viability of blockchain as a service layer for panels? But then the other end, it could, with greater communication and transparency, like you've said previously, Andrew, there could be opportunity for us to garner even more participation from a wider audience. So, that's why we have potentially question mark. There's just really not a clear answer that on that front. Okay, so let's talk about the value of blockchain. We wanted to understand, among all the different potential upside on blockchain, what was most important. And originally we had presented this data for the top 2 box, and we saw, very little change from feature to feature. And then we wanted to look at just the top box of those folks, and how they value blockchain. And you do see more variety here in the responses, but this is just sort of a kind of brief overview of the different features and benefits associated with blockchain. There's even more that could be leveraged that I'm quite curious and maybe we'll do in a part 2. But the big takeaway, I think, is that security really matters most. And that's what we can see from this data. All of the features that are related to security, protection of information, a greater sense of trust, all of those scored pretty high here in comparison to some of the other features. So not terribly surprising, but something important to note there. So Andrew, I think you were going to cover this next slide, some takeaways on trust.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's worth sort of driving this issue home. I hear a lot when I talk to people that people aren't concerned, right? They use Facebook, even though they're aware of potential data issues, but they still use the service, so they're not concerned about the security or data protection. And that's just not true. People are concerned, but in the case of Facebook and other service providers, they're willing to make a trade-off around that concern, to say, yes, I'm concerned, but the value exchange is such, the service is so great, I'm willing to take that risk, as it were. And the question to me is always, if you're a market research company, what is your value proposition to your participants that would allow you to have a low level of trust and still a high level of concern, and still get them interact with you? And I think we don't have that same level of a value proposition as some of these other companies like Facebook or Google, for example. So we have to work under this realization that people are concerned with their data, and we have to act appropriately. And the other thing I quite often hear, well, this is the old people, right? And the data shows it's the same 77% amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. So it's not that young people are less concerned around this issue. Maybe they have better ways and better tools to deal with it, but their level of concern, their level of worry about this issue is equally high. The second thing we want to drive home really is to, if you believe and you understand that people are concerned about the use and the misuse of their data, one of the reasons for this is that many people consider different types of their personal data to be sensitive. And if you look at this list that you have down the bottom, market research companies collect a lot of this data, not health records necessarily, but some of these issues. We ask income, for example. We might ask people for their location if we're doing a mobile survey. So all of these things create a level of uncertainty, a level of concern if we ask these questions, particularly if we don't explain to people why we're asking them. What are we using this information for? So we need to be really careful about that. I thought, looking at some of the details on this, one of the things that made me laugh, Lisa, when I looked at this was that if you looked at wealthy people in our sample compared to less wealthy, on the one hand, they were concerned about their health records, but they were also concerned about their criminal records. So I thought that was quite interesting, that was more of a problem for the richer people in our sample. And if you look at young people, for them, the IP address, the mobile location, those were a couple of things that stood out as being considered very sensitive by younger people. So I think it's really good, if you work in market research, if you ask people these types of questions, please be aware of just how sensitive many people you're talking to consider these to be.
Yeah, no, I think this was interesting. From my perspective, and I've been in the space almost 17 years now, I would say our appetite for PII, personally identifiable information, is at an all-time high. I get so many different requests from different clients looking to collect PII in their surveys, whether it's for segmentation analysis, classification, validation. I mean, there's a lot of different drivers for why that level of detail is needed. But it's really becoming more and more regularly requested, Andrew. And at the same time, you've got these data breaches being widely publicized. You've got GDPR, CCPA. We'll probably see something at the federal level here in the US pretty soon. I know for a fact in the state that I live in, I'm based in New York, legislators in Albany right now are debating a bill that's coming up for review this summer and likely to pass, that's even stricter than the one in California, the CCPA. So all of that certainly has quite a few implications for us as researchers. And so I think this data is a great reminder that we need to be careful. We need to be mindful of when we really need that data, when it's a must-have versus when it's a nice-to-have.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, this next slide sort of really drives that message home. So here we asked, whether people think that it's appropriate and to what extent it's appropriate that market research companies, collect and use their personal data. And as you can see, only 1/3 of the people think it's appropriate. And these are people obviously participating in surveys, giving their data. So, we've got to be really careful. And on the one hand, yes, think twice. Do we really need this personal data? And secondly, be as transparent as we can about why we need it, what we're using the data for, and hopefully they have that understanding that will allow them to consider it appropriate. I think, Lisa, one of the challenges in practice we have is that, especially with low incidence at the moment, a person trying to qualify for a survey could be asked their age and sex, maybe 10 times within an hour when trying to take a survey. And that alone, creates a certain level of distrust and misunderstanding. Why are they asking all these personal questions about me repeatedly? So, one of the conclusions really, make sure if you're talking with your sample providers, that they have the technology to pass the data between themselves, so we don't end up in this loop of continuing asking somebody, what's your age, what's your gender. It's not only frustrating, but it also increases the level of skepticism with our ability to manage the data.
I think that's a great point, Andrew. And I have these conversations quite a bit with different clients where, I can pass these key demographics through the URL so that they have that data in real time. But most clients, most people in the research space nowadays would just soon rather collect it on their end. But it's it's a redundant experience, right? And it does lead participants to think, hey, are they storing my information, or are they having trouble keeping track of it? Like, why do they keep re-asking this question over and over again? So it makes us seem irresponsible with their data, and it definitely helps to reduce the overall trust perception. That's for sure.
Which reduces overall response rates and participation rates, which has a negative impact on data quality. So, users have to weigh up the the point of having the data within your own survey against, okay, if you're doing that, you're destroying trust over time and reducing people's likelihood to participate in your next survey. So, really something that needs to be considered very carefully.
Absolutely. So the next one here is around participant frustrations. We wanted to understand, really what about the survey participant experience is causing frustration for folks. And, we put in some different examples here, like not qualifying for the survey, which you can see is really high. That's at 74%. And I think that, Andrew, that's because a lot of people in our space don't realize that the average panel has a conversion rate of sub 10%, because we're trying to find for that, needle in a haystack syndrome that we've been facing, especially as the space gets more and more mature. And so people have a negative experience more often than they do positive. And you have to ask yourself, would you do anything if you failed 9 out of 10 times? And so it generates a lot of attrition within panels, which leads to all sorts of issues around feasibility and responsiveness, and making sure that you have good representation in your sample. The other thing here too is that we're also seeing that, surveys are just too long. 59, almost 60% of the population indicated that they felt surveys were too long. And I know, Andrew, you and I have shared data on that in the past. We help field thousands and thousands of surveys at our business, and we see LOIs around 23, 24 minutes on average. So it's 2019, mobile penetration rates are incredibly high, but we are continuing to see pretty long surveys. And so that in itself is a negative for participants.
Well, Lisa, I think, you need to combine these two things together, right? So, and in particular, our call to clients and agencies alike to keep screeners as short as possible, right? Because if we're screening people out to such a regular extent, And, even if it's just a 3-minute screener, if you're only qualifying on average for 1 in 10, you're spending more or less 30 minutes being screened out before you actually get to take that 24-minute survey. So, in practice, you could be spending up to an hour of your time to get the incentive for that one survey, which is, I don't know, Lisa, in today's world, it's not very much, right? So, that brings you to item 3 on the list. So people aren't earning much money because they're having to go through a huge rescreening process to get to one long survey. And that's something, as an industry, we need to change, irrespective of what we do with the blockchain solution, right? The blockchain solution can help if it can help us more quickly identify people. So if we can get them the right survey more easily, that's a great thing blockchain could do. And that's something I'd like to see. But, we need to fix these other issues, right? Once they've qualified, if we give them a 25-minute survey which doesn't work on a mobile device, all the data security in the world is not going to help them feel good about the experience.
Right, that's exactly right. And I think, if you think about some of the kind of needs from our clients, typically clients want to dispatch a general sample population. They don't want to use targeted or pre-targeted sample because it's artificial. It's an artificial procurement of the sample frame, right? And so there's techniques around that, but I think, trying to get a more relevant survey to the right respondent is certainly something I want to do, but often my hands are tied because buyers of sample typically want to do things like click balancing or general population random stratified sample frame that sort of weeds out respondents that wouldn't qualify, but it generates a lot of spoilage in the sample. And so those two things are in conflict with each other. And
Right.
So there's a lot of things in motion, Andrew, that we're going to need to change. And the thing around and not earning enough money, I mean, from our perspective at Innovate MR, we actually, I think, are one of the only research firms, sample firms, that offers incentives for people who don't qualify. And I think it is an investment for our owners. They recognize that sometimes it makes sense to make these long-term investments to generate a more responsive, more highly engaged panel. But I can tell you, we are absolutely an anomaly. And that's because, probably because we're one of the only independently owned, self-funded firms out there. And so when you've got a lot of VC private equity firms that are in the driver's seat around the strategy of panel management, panel procurement, sample deployment, you're going to look at incentives as the first place to cut and really squeeze. And I know that's because a lot of us in the business are feeling the pressure of compressed CPIs, right? We're in 2019, and there's some clients that are just unwilling to budge on their CPI, and that does have a trickle-down effect onto the participant experience. So there's just so many different variables at play here and things that are very detrimental to our space that absolutely need to change in order for us to truly, I think, embrace blockchain. Like, blockchain on its own is really intriguing. It's cool technology, but I don't see it being a commercially viable option unless some of these other things change along the way. And it's not just sort of the management of sample, the deployment of sample, it's the appetite among those who are buyers of sample.
Well, hopefully, we got some buyers either on the agency or the client side on the call today and on the webinar, and hopefully we're giving them a perspective to think about this quality issue, this impact on the participant issue when they're making these decisions, right? So there's both a short-term issue and there's a longer-term issue about sustainability in our ecosystem, and I think we need to try and balance those two aspects moving forward, and blockchain can be part of that solution. But in addition to that, everybody with skin in the game, so to speak, has to do a better job at giving participants a better experience. That's the short answer to this.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why we've been so actively involved in the participant engagement initiative through the GRBN, your association, Andrew. And I know there's been many companies that have also put their name in the ring and have put skin in the game. We ourselves have done a lot of changes internally, around panel satisfaction, incentivization for terminating events, things like that, to really help prop up the experience our panelists are having. And I know other companies are joining in on the good cause, both on the sample side as well as full service agency side, and also on the end client brand side. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see continued participation in that program, because it's something I feel really passionate about. I know you do too. And so I would just encourage those attendees on the webinar today to definitely get involved and reach out to you, Andrew, if they haven't already. Okay, so let's just jump into a revisit of our study objectives. Again, we wanted to understand how participants were perceiving blockchain, want to get a sense if it would increase or decrease trust, and of course, see if it could help to improve participation rates. And I think, from the data you can see there's still some question marks, but there are some major themes that have surfaced through this research process. What is needed for blockchain to be successful? What is needed for our ecosystem? It's more communication, and it can't be sort of that typical language like, we need your address and name for classification purposes. Your data will be maintained in a secure environment. That type of language, Andrew, I see all the time that's presented to participants. And unfortunately, I just don't think that that's enough. We need to provide more detail, a more robust explanation of how that data is being used, how it's being stored, when it will be deleted. We need to get more we need to sort of increase the level of explanation that we give to participants. The other thing too is around education and transparency. All of that is going to improve trust, and we really need to improve the experience for all of this to work. That was a big takeaway for me when we looked at that data. And so let's just revisit the key takeaways. Again, awareness is low, transparent communication and education are needed, trust in MR is low, and blockchain technology could definitely help us improve trust. Though few people have a positive disposition to blockchain today based on our research, but that could certainly change as we increase that trust and increase that communication. We do think that participation rates could increase. We're not 100% on that. We think all of these variables are sort of interconnected, and so we need more time to understand the relationships between those. But of course, like Andrew and I have mentioned, there are definitely other variables influencing the participant experience outside of any kind of benefit that could come about through blockchain tech. So we definitely need to address those. And I think getting folks to participate in the GRBN's Participant Engagement Initiative is a great start to sort of help your organization look at what you're doing, what your standard operating procedures are, how do they help to influence the participant experience? Is there an opportunity to do more on that, to get the various constituents that each of us have to support and work with to really think about participants first? Because really, if it's not a great experience as you're collecting that data from these participants, then the insights themselves that are driving major business decisions are in fact in question. So it's all interconnected, and we all need to be mindful of that. And I think the big takeaway for me, Andrew, is that there's research that's lacking. We need to do more work here to really understand if blockchain and other security solutions would really heighten participation rates and really provide a commercially viable option. When you think about some of those things I was talking about earlier around feasibility and representation and people's appetite to pay larger incentives, larger CPIs, so that we can incentivize properly, and also an appetite to use more targeted forms of sample versus the Gen Pop strategy that so many of our clients require. And that is it in terms of reviewing the findings. We have about 11 minutes or so for questions. Let's see, Britt, if you're on the line, I'm hoping that some questions have been coming in as Andrew and I have been presenting. What do you got for us?
Yes, we have a few. I wasn't biased on this by name, I promise, but Brittany had a question. Does the awareness concern become a moot point if we simply call it something else?
That's a great question. I think, Yeah, we could call blockchain a data graph as an example. I've seen it referred to as that. I mean, whatever we call it is a different way of managing data than we have done historically as an industry. And I think it doesn't really matter what we call it if we decide to call it something else. What matters is that we're really transparent, open with participants on how data is being stored, how it's being used, what the sort of tenure of that data storage is. And who we're sharing it with. And I think a lot of companies sort of solely rely on an 8 or 9 page privacy policy to sort of do the heavy lifting for them. And from my perspective, I just think we need better ways of communicating our privacy policies and protocols to participants. I mean, on our side, what we've done is we have sort of a shortened version, sort of a quick pick kind of bulleted point list that we present to people on the main key themes around our privacy management. And of course, it links to the longer document, which is really standard. But I think little things like that and just the way we communicate, instead of saying, we're going to collect personally identifiable information from you for classification purposes, it will be kept secure. That's not enough. We need to do more and take on more as it relates to how we're communicating. So regardless of how we label blockchain or use some other term, I think it's just we need to be more transparent.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Lisa. I mean, I think the main point is transparency, right? We need to explain what's going to happen and how. And if you're doing that, people are going to say, well, isn't that blockchain? And isn't that using blockchain technology to do that? And if you don't say that up front, then those people who are aware of this are going to sort of doubt you. They're going to become again skeptical of why are you saying this and why are you not calling it blockchain if you are using blockchain. So I think you need to think really carefully, and as a researcher, I'd say test it. Go out and test, talk with people, and come up with a communication strategy based on your audience and what works for them. And you might find out that it should be both, right? It should use the word blockchain, but in addition, it should be very clear and precise in describing and showing how the data is collected and stored and used. So I think it's going to be both use the name and be transparent.
Fully agree. What else you got for us, Britt?
Great. We have one from Michelle. What is the connection between cryptocurrency and blockchain MR?
Do you want to take that one, Andrew, or shall I?
Well, I can start. I mean, basically, again, depending on the solution that the provider can use, I mean, they can combine these two things. So they can, create an incentive model around cryptocurrency. So that would be totally possible to, create an MR blockchain solution and embed within it a cryptocurrency-based incentive system. But that's not necessary. A blockchain MR solution can work perfectly fine with no form of cryptocurrency involvement. That incentives would be just the way they are today. The technology would just be used to store the data and how the data is going to be captured and collected. So, there isn't necessarily a connection, but there could be if you want there to be. Lisa, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great response. What else, Britt?
We have another one from Shell. Do you believe those who use Facebook specifically, but other social medias also, really understand the potential security risks for their data and are willing to make the trade-off? Or is it that they don't really know the risk and trust they are just being taken care of by Facebook?
That's a great question. There's a lot to unpack there.
I mean, I don't know, Lisa. I would say looking at the data we have on the level of trust. So, you saw the level of trust in social media companies, and it's not just Facebook, right? It's all social media companies. That the level of trust is low, and we added a different type of question to ask specifically about trust related to the use of data and personal data, and then the trust level goes even lower. So from the data, I would say that people are at least aware conceptually what the risks are and do that trade-off. But obviously there are also people out there who aren't aware and are using it as well. But I would say the majority, at least conceptually, even if they don't know in detail what specific risks there are, there's a feeling of risk and a feeling of a lack of trust because of that.
Yeah, and I think after the last year we've had with, the different breaches that we've seen, and security issues we've seen both from Facebook and other large social media brands and businesses, it was interesting. I was looking at some data, and I can certainly share it with folks on the line if they'd like to see it, but it was something we presented at SampleCon. Andrew, you might remember this. Like the number of breaches in the last year have actually gone down, but the amount of data exposed has gone up by something like 126%.
Wow.
And then I think at the same time, the media has really bitten onto this. And so they're really publicizing this. And so I think there's a low trust factor here and a greater level of awareness around these types of breaches. So even like the number of breaches going down, I think that doesn't matter. I think the damage, it has gone up 126% in terms of the amount of data exposed. And people are really more aware.
Right.
So if we'd gotten this question say five years ago, 3 years ago even, I would say that a lot of folks did sort of just trust the internet and trust these different social media companies. But I think a level of skepticism has really increased over the last 12 months. And, I may base that on my sort of small universe of colleagues and industry friends. But it's sort of like, okay, if you're going to be on the internet, you sort of have to come into it recognizing that your data could be breached at some point, and that the way that your data is being managed is not as you intend it to be. But I think you're seeing a lot of federal, state level legislation coming out across the world. I mean, GDPR was, in my opinion, a total game changer for how companies view and deal with data collection and managing data. I mean, for a long time, it felt like the Wild West. But those days are over. They're gone.
Great. We have one more question if you guys have time for it. This one comes from Amanda. What other benefits could be realized from blockchain outside of better security?
Well, I think we touched on those a little bit. I think obviously there's the security factor. There's potentially an increase in trust. But I think if we could help reduce the amount of redundant information that is collected throughout the research process, that would be a huge value add. So that example of, okay, the sample companies, reconfirming information, and then that information is again asked by the client within the client survey. And then if a participant takes the survey again, it's sort of rinse and repeat. So there's a lot of that reconfirming of information that I've just given to you literally in the last hour, because our systems, the ecosystem within the systems within this ecosystem are not communicating in a programmatic way as best they can. And so, that theoretically could be solved with blockchain. But I think the question mark for me, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is, is there an appetite to use more pre-screened targeted data and respondent data? A lot of our clients like a more traditional methodology, like a click balance or like a general population dispatch sample send. And in my mind, we have to sort of move away from that and find some of the methodologies on the back end that allow us to still sort of get the rigor that we require as researchers, but also provide a more relevant, higher converting experience for participants. And we can achieve that. There's weighting and different methodologies that can be employed on the back end to help offset some of those concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I could see advantages, if this works properly. There's a potential advantage of the ability to sort of cross data that wasn't necessarily collected in the same survey instruments. So, if it was a total sort of open exchange of data where you had this sort of permanent respondent level data, the segmentation for one survey could then be used to explore attitudes from a different survey. But that would obviously involve agreement from all parties, right? So the people fielding the different surveys would have to be open for their data being shared with other companies, and it would obviously need agreement from the participants to have their data used in this way, because GDPR and other requirements, require this explicit consent to the use of data. So that there's issues around both of those things. But if those can be solved, then this does open up an opportunity to create, different types of data that didn't exist before, get new insights, and maybe for the participant, to offer them ways to monetize their data over time. So, I think there's some exciting potential usage of blockchain technology to do this, but there's a lot of hurdles to be overcome before it's a practical solution.
Well said, Andrew. I think that's it from our end, Britt. We're at the top of the hour here.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll compile all the questions that we couldn't get to, and we'll get those answered and sent out along with a recording of today's webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Lisa and Andrew. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Lisa. Great co-presenting with you, and thanks everybody for listening today. Thanks for taking the time.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.